Right, hi, I'm Gregory Moran, Senior Clinical Educator at Derby, working in HGOL, undergraduate medical education, mainly with fourth year medical students, but I also work with trainee ACPs who are actually being developed into the medical workforce. And this is like a literature review we wrote as part of a plan for a 3-year research study into the transition of advanced clinical practitioners, how they go from being experts in one role to complete beginners when they start their training and go through that training. Is there anything that, what makes that training good, what makes that training bad, how can we improve it? Because at the end of the day, they're going to be working alongside you guys as the older doctors, they're going to be working with you, so we want to make that training and the outcome of that training as good as we can. This research has been done alongside Claire Sutherland, who's the corporate lead for advanced practice in Derby, and it started off as a single centre study, but actually we actually gathered expert researchers from various areas in the region. It became a multi-centre study, so we're at the point now where we're applying for funding for this for a 3-year project, and I'll let you know how that goes at some other point. So when the literature we reviewed in this review covered a number of continents, a number of countries, yet the findings were very, very similar wherever we went, and they've since, and I've had to do another literature search to bring up to date, showed very similar results. And also there's some research being done in Derby on nurse practitioners, which again shows very similar results in terms of how people transition and what can make it a good transition or a bad transition. So we checked the quality, so we used Walsh and Down to check the quality, and as it turned out all the studies came out as very good, and we identified 6 key problematic areas within this transition which, if they're all done correctly, then the ACPs that actually go through that practice actually develop as much better rounded out professionals. But if those elements are not actually done to the best that they can be done, there are problems to the extent some of the studies showed that trainees just left. They just stopped their training and went back to their previous jobs because it was far, far too stressful. Now, nobody's saying that medical education, any other health profession training is not stressful, but we're talking about much higher levels of stress. So what we found was, in terms of people having experience of change in their working environment, obviously these people are coming from different health environments, healthcare environments, and quite often at expert levels, and they've been through a number of jobs, so they've got that experience. And it's been assumed that that was a benefit, but actually now we're thinking that's been overestimated, and actually it doesn't make a lot of difference. The fact that they can't right at the beginning of this training, it doesn't help at all because it's completely alien right at the beginning. And also it was found that even though people had developed skills from in other areas, they weren't transferable immediately. They needed a body of knowledge and skills developed in the first few years or first year of training before you could start to adapt that previous knowledge and skills to it. In terms of orientation, extremely important. And you would know this from when you remember when you were all medical students, that orientation is very, very important. Yet a lot of the research suggested that in a lot of these studies there was no orientation, or what took place was very poor, or it was just superficial, or it was just opportunistic, depending on who was around at the time. Some of the studies described good orientation, but what they used was words like structured and organised. Hopefully that's what we've got now, but that's not what was reflected from these studies from a number of areas all over the world. Mentorship, again, a key area. And there are reasons why there's been problems with mentorship. If you think about how education, medical education and health education in general has changed over the last few decades, actually, it's been a massive shift from classroom-based teaching into clinical placement teaching, and consequently that the number of mentors and clinical supervisors skyrocketed, and we've not had the ability to train all those people. And also some of the way this has been introduced in some areas, if you go back 10, 20 years, was a very sort of top-down approach where people were given roles as opposed to developed into roles, and therefore there was a reaction to that, quite often a negative reaction. But the truth was we didn't have enough experienced mentors, and mentorship is essential in terms of developing good health professionals. Clinical skills, it's an area I'm involved in with medical students, teaching clinical examination skills and history taking skills. So I've been able to transfer those skills over to training ACPs. But in terms of the studies we looked at, the access to clinical skills training wasn't necessarily there to the extent it should have been there. There were some areas that had developed their own. They were trying to develop bespoke study skills workshops, but some areas it was purely down to the students trying to find people who could help them train, and that's not ideal for anybody who's trying to develop into a serious health role, particularly a new health role. And so that was a really, really big weakness in a lot of the studies that we looked at. Similarly, clinical supervision, which was that role was largely taken up by doctors, and again, quite often they weren't familiar with the role that they were being allocated for clinical supervision for. They didn't know what to do with the ACPs, and this is no disrespect to doctors in those roles. It was just that's exactly what was happening, where organisations would actually decided they were going to do this, but then they were allocating responsibility, that there was no development and no preparation for it. And therefore, quite often the trainees were just left in the wake on the ward rounds. Nobody knew what to do with them, and consequently they weren't being taught. And again, we also, just like all of the training, there's an established level of education that's required, and now it's established that all ACP trainees will follow an MSc level path of education. And again, in a lot of these studies, it was shown that the educational programs that were in place were not fit for purpose for ACPs. They were okay in terms of what they were delivering, but the requirements for advanced clinical practitioners were at a much higher level, and the courses weren't adapted, and therefore a lot of the students that were coming through these courses felt that they weren't being developed, they weren't prepared for practice. There were areas where they were, but generally they weren't. If you look at this, you can see that I had to copy this, so you can see that this is one of the other things we noticed when I was going through these studies. Words associated with the experience. Now, on the left, you've got like positive comments like excited, supporting, empowering. But if you look on the right hand side, all those negative comments. I mean, if you try and put yourself in, remember back to when you were medical students. Could you describe your training with words like that? You know, because that is horrendous to put people through that. You know, ranging from, you know, just anxiety and apprehension to scared to death. You know, this is how people were actually describing their training. Now, thankfully, the areas I'm associated with, I don't think it's as bad as that anymore, but that's what we've got, and that's what we want to look at. So I was describing this in this literature review in terms of how training had gone, and what we're planning to look at now is 4 major hospitals in our region to see if we're now actually advanced and we're actually developing ACPs at the level required, and if we're not doing it, what can we do to make that better? If we are doing it, how have we improved, and do we meet the requirements? So, you know, I don't want to sort of prejudge the outcome, but that's what we're aiming at, and that was just like a process that if you're looking at that. On the top level, you've got all the key areas that we're looking at, and if they actually, as I said right at the beginning, if they're actually in place to the level that we require, then that process of qualification, of transition and socialisation is as we require, and the ACPs that are developed. And again, don't forget, you're working with them, so then, you know, you would expect them to be very good. If those elements are not provided, then unfortunately the ACPs that are developed, they're still capable people, but those extra elements that are required, it takes longer to develop. So that's it really. Those are the studies that we use, by the way, if you can recognise any of those. Anyway, any questions?